What would you do if you walked into a courtroom knowing your life was over? Not in the abstract sense, not metaphorically, but in a way that is literal, irrevocable, and crushingly final? That is exactly the reality that Nick Reiner faced just a few days ago, and the moment has now gone viral. Within seconds, millions of people across the globe were watching, reacting, and sharing, trying to make sense of a silence that spoke louder than words ever could. He asked for a moment. And then he said nothing. Nothing at all. It's the kind of silence that fills a room with tension so thick, you could almost cut it with a knife. Imagine cameras trained on you, journalists scribbling notes, your family staring silently, and an entire internet watching, dissecting your every twitch, every blink, every subtle shift in posture. And yet, Nick Reiner did not speak. For 32 years, he had lived in the shadow of a family renowned for their brilliance and success. Rob Reiner, the legendary director whose films have shaped the cultural landscape of modern America. Michelle Singer Reiner, a photographer whose work captured lives, emotions, and beauty with an almost uncanny precision. And now, in a single, horrific incident, both were dead, and their son stood accused of ending their lives. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The setting is a sprawling Brentwood estate in Los Angeles, a $13.5 million home where luxury and artistry once mingled effortlessly. On Sunday, December 14th, a day that started with the usual quiet of a Los Angeles morning, descended into chaos and tragedy. The first to discover the unthinkable were not investigators, not law enforcement, but a family member. Romy, the Reiner's daughter, had gone to check on her parents. The scene she encountered would haunt anyone who saw it. The home, usually a sanctuary filled with light, creativity, and laughter, had transformed into a crime scene straight out of a nightmare. Rob and Michelle were both found stabbed to death, victims of what the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner would later define as multiple sharp force injuries, a term clinical and precise, yet utterly horrifying in its implications. The cause of death was homicide, leaving no room for doubt. Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son who had lived in the guest house on the estate, was arrested later that very night. Law enforcement reports indicate he has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and the use of a dangerous weapon, specifically a knife. The news sent shockwaves not only through Hollywood but through the entire world. Rob Reiner was a household name, a director whose work on films like When Harry Met Sally and A Few Good Men had made him an icon. Michelle Reiner, though less publicly known, had carved out a respected career in photography. And now, with both of them gone, the world was left grappling with the unimaginable, that their own son could be responsible. But let's pause for a moment and think about the human element here. These are not abstract figures in a headline. These were parents, people who nurtured, guided, and shaped the life of their children. And their lives ended in a way that no one could have anticipated. When tragedy strikes so close to home, when it pierces through the veneer of public life and fame, it makes us question everything we thought we knew about family, loyalty, and the hidden currents of human behavior. How does a son, raised in privilege, in love, and presumably in care, arrive at a point where the unthinkable happens? Courtroom footage, now circulating widely, captures a moment that will be remembered for years. Nick Reiner, seated before the judge, requested a brief pause. A moment to collect himself, to perhaps utter a word in his defense. And yet, when that moment came, he said nothing. The silence was deafening, heavy with implication, a canvas onto which everyone watching could project their own interpretations. Was it shock? Remorse? Calculated restraint? Or was it something else entirely? Something darker that would only reveal itself with time? Millions of viewers wondered, paused, and speculated. Clips of that moment flooded social media feeds within minutes, sparking debates, hot takes, and endless theories. People dissected every movement, every glance, and every hesitation. This was no ordinary court appearance. This was a viral event before it even began, a tragedy turned into a spectacle, a human drama played out in real time across thousands of screens. What makes this case even more riveting, even more gut-wrenching, is the stark contrast between the public image of the Reiners and the private horror of the event. On the surface, they were a celebrated family, living in a beautiful estate, creating and enjoying the fruits of decades of work in art and cinema. Beneath that surface, the night of December 14th revealed a darkness that no one had foreseen. It is this contradiction, the luminous public persona versus the dark private reality, that forms the beating heart of this story. And it is what will drive the chapters to come, as we peel back layer after layer of a family's history, the events leading up to the tragedy, and the immediate aftermath that has captivated millions. But here is where the story becomes even more compelling. Within hours of the arrests and initial reports, additional details emerged, deepening the mystery and raising new questions. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office released an official report confirming the cause and manner of death. Yet questions remained. What exactly happened in those final hours? Were there warning signs that no one noticed? How did Nick Reiner, living just steps away in the guest house, factor into the sequence of events that culminated in the deaths of his parents? And most provocatively, what was going through his mind in that courtroom moment? The moment that the world has now seen over and over again. This story matters now more than ever. It's a cautionary tale, yes, but it's also a real-time exploration of human behavior, family dynamics, and the way public and private lives can collide in ways that are both tragic and shocking. It's about privilege, expectation, and the pressures of living in the shadow of fame. It's about the unpredictable and often frightening nature of human emotion and action. And as the legal proceedings continue, as social media continues to dissect every nuance, and as experts weigh in with psychological and criminological insights, one thing is certain: this story is far from over. So what comes next? How did investigators piece together the puzzle so quickly? What does the forensic evidence reveal that the public hasn't yet grasped? How do friends, neighbors, and family interpret the viral courtroom moment? And most importantly, what does Nick Reiner's silence really mean? These questions will guide the journey of this video, chapter by chapter, as we dig into the details, unravel the mysteries, and explore the emotional, psychological, and societal ramifications of a tragedy that has captured the world's attention. What happens when a home transforms from a sanctuary into a scene of unimaginable horror? For the Reiners, their Brentwood estate, a sprawling, sun-drenched property worth $13.5 million, became exactly that on the morning of December 14th. Imagine the juxtaposition: a place designed for comfort, privacy, and family gatherings, now frozen in the chaos of violence. The driveway, lined with pristine hedges and expensive vehicles, seemed untouched. Yet inside, a scene awaited investigators that would be seared into their memories forever. The first to discover the tragedy was Romy, the Reiner's daughter. She had arrived to check on her parents, worried after unanswered calls and missed plans. She walked through the elegant entryway, a place usually filled with light reflecting off polished floors and the warm hues of carefully curated art. Instead, she was met with silence. Not the calm, comforting silence of a quiet home, but the oppressive, unnatural silence that screams that something is very, very wrong. As she stepped further, the scene unfolded in the most horrific way possible. Her parents, Rob and Michelle, lying motionless, victims of brutal sharp force injuries. Investigators would later describe the injuries as multiple stab wounds, the kind that are not only lethal but indicate a level of rage or intent difficult to comprehend. The forensic terminology, sharp force injuries, does little to capture the visceral reality of the crime. The blood, the positioning of the bodies, the chaos of the immediate surroundings, all painted a picture of violence that was both calculated and personal. In homes where people feel safe, the shock of such brutality is magnified. Every object in the room, the furniture, the art on the walls, even the personal items strewn in apparent disarray, became pieces of a puzzle that detectives would spend hours trying to reconstruct. The initial police response was rapid. Within minutes of Romy's 911 call, uniformed officers were on the scene. Crime scene units swept in, cameras flashing, taking thousands of photographs, documenting every angle, every drop of blood, every minor detail. In a case like this, nothing could be overlooked. Every chair, every rug, every object in the room could hold clues, fibers, fingerprints, DNA, that might explain what happened in the hours leading up to the murders. And yet, despite the meticulous documentation, there was an eerie quiet that hung over the scene, an almost cinematic stillness that made it clear this was a moment frozen in time, one that would forever haunt those who entered. As investigators began their work, they quickly turned their attention to the method of the killings. The precision and intensity of the stab wounds indicated that the assailant was not only familiar with the victims, but also willing to engage in an act of extreme violence. Each injury told a story, a movement, a confrontation, a struggle. Forensic teams analyzed the angles, depth, and placement of the wounds, attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events. The goal was not only to understand what happened, but also why it happened in such a brutal manner. Outside the home, neighbors were in shock. Brentwood is an area synonymous with wealth, celebrity, and tranquility. Murders of this magnitude are not something the community experiences every day. Witnesses would later describe seeing emergency vehicles, flashing lights, and a swarm of media trucks descending upon the neighborhood. News crews captured the reactions of stunned residents, some of whom had known the Reiners for years. The shock was universal. No one could reconcile the image of a happy, successful family with the violent tragedy that had unfolded behind closed doors. Inside the estate, every detail mattered. Investigators documented the position of the bodies, noting that both Rob and Michelle were found in separate rooms. The distribution suggested a chaotic, perhaps panicked confrontation. There were signs of a struggle, overturned furniture, and broken objects, but the scene was not completely random. Certain areas were untouched, indicating that the assailant had a specific focus or intent. Every minute, every detail, contributed to a growing understanding that this was not a crime of opportunity. It was a deliberate act with personal motivation. One of the most critical aspects of the crime scene was the guest house, where Nick Reiner lived. While the main house had become a tableau of violence, the guest house offered investigators insight into the daily life and habits of the accused. Was there any indication of tension, prior conflict, or unusual behavior in the days leading up to the murders? Were there signs that Nick had been planning this act, or was it an impulsive eruption of violence? Forensic teams would examine everything from surveillance footage to personal devices, piecing together a digital footprint that might shed light on the unthinkable. The medical examiner would later confirm the cause of death as multiple sharp force injuries, the manner of death ruled as homicide. But the report, while clinical, could not convey the human reality of the scene. A home once filled with laughter, memories, and art, now transformed into a chilling testament to mortality. The precision of the wounds, combined with the personal nature of the attack, pointed investigators toward a suspect who was intimately familiar with the victims. The kind of closeness only a family member could have. Yet, even with these pieces of the puzzle in place, questions lingered. How had this act gone unnoticed until it was discovered by Romy? Had there been warning signs? Could anyone have predicted that a son living just steps away in the guest house could commit such a heinous crime? These questions would dominate not only the investigation but also the public discourse, as news outlets, social media commentators, and forensic experts speculated on motives, psychology, and the dynamics of a family now shattered. The crime scene was just the beginning, the opening chapter of a story that would unfold over weeks and months, capturing global attention. Every investigator who entered the home, every forensic expert who analyzed the evidence, and every journalist who reported on the unfolding tragedy would carry with them the weight of what they had seen. And for viewers now witnessing the viral courtroom moment, understanding the details of the crime scene provides crucial context. It is here, amid the forensic evidence, the personal details, and the quiet terror of the estate, that the foundation for the rest of the story is laid. Who exactly is the man at the center of this tragedy? Nick Reiner, 32, the son accused of murdering his own parents, is not a name most people knew before December 14th. But now, his life, personality, and choices are under intense scrutiny. To understand the magnitude of this story, we need to understand Nick, not as a headline, not as a viral courtroom clip, but as a human being whose life intersected with privilege, expectation, and ultimately, catastrophe. Nick was born into a family that, on the surface, had everything: fame, wealth, opportunity. His father, Rob Reiner, is a legendary filmmaker whose works have shaped generations. His mother, Michelle Singer Reiner, was a talented photographer whose career captured human emotion with extraordinary depth. Growing up in Brentwood, Los Angeles, Nick had access to every advantage a young person could dream of: elite schools, travel, exposure to art and culture, and a family network embedded deeply in Hollywood. From the outside, it might have seemed like a life of unending privilege, but appearances are often deceiving. Friends and acquaintances describe Nick as a complex individual. Outwardly, he was polite, quiet, and observant. He wasn't the flamboyant type that Hollywood sometimes produces. He preferred to remain in the background, living in the guest house while his parents occupied the main estate. But behind closed doors, there were glimpses of a personality that raised questions, moods that swung, moments of isolation, and periods of intense focus on personal projects or interests that seemed disconnected from family life. Those who knew him often say that Nick could be charming, intelligent, and engaging, but there was also a side of him that was private to the point of secrecy. In recent years, Nick had maintained a low-profile existence. Unlike his father, he wasn't a public figure, nor was he a media personality. He had ambitions, hobbies, and social connections, but his life did not attract the same attention as the Reiner legacy. That invisibility, in many ways, may have been a double-edged sword. On one hand, it shielded him from the relentless scrutiny of fame. On the other, it created a certain detachment from the outside world, a sense of life existing in parallel to, rather than intertwined with, the family he lived among. Social media provides only a fragmented view of Nick's personality. Sparse posts, mostly private interactions, and a curated online presence reveal little. But experts analyzing behavior in high-profile cases often stress that these fragments can hint at patterns, subtle signs of stress, isolation, or unresolved conflict. Was there tension between Nick and his parents? Did he feel overshadowed by his father's fame, or trapped by expectations? While speculation must be handled carefully, patterns in behavior, living arrangements, and personal interactions can offer clues. Family friends recount stories that, in hindsight, may appear telling. Small incidents, disagreements, or unspoken frustrations could now be interpreted as warning signs. In one account, a neighbor mentioned that Nick sometimes seemed withdrawn, spending long hours in the guest house without interacting much with family or visitors. Another anecdote suggested moments of quiet irritation or tension when discussing financial matters or family decisions. While none of these incidents predicted a murder, they contribute to a larger picture of a man whose inner life was complex, fraught, and perhaps misunderstood. The psychological dimension is also crucial. Nick, like any human, had coping mechanisms, internal struggles, and emotional dynamics that only close observation could reveal. Forensic psychologists emphasize that extreme acts of violence often stem from a combination of factors: stress, personal grievances, emotional dysregulation, and situational triggers. Understanding Nick means exploring these dimensions: how he processed emotion, how he responded to conflict, and how he interacted with those closest to him. The viral courtroom moment. His request for a pause, followed by absolute silence, offers a window into this psychology. Was it shock, guilt, strategy, or something else entirely? Nick's life also raises questions about expectation and inheritance. Growing up in a family of high achievers can create immense pressure. Some children internalize these expectations, striving to match or exceed parental accomplishments. Others rebel, retreat, or struggle quietly in ways that go unnoticed. Nick's living situation. The guest house, slightly apart from the main family activity, may reflect a physical and symbolic separation from his parents' world. This separation, combined with internalized pressures, could have contributed to escalating tension that culminated in the events of December 14th. What's equally striking is the contrast between Nick's private life and the public perception of his family. To outsiders, the Reiners epitomized success, harmony, and accomplishment. But private life is often messier than the public eye allows. Family dynamics, rivalries, and unspoken resentments can fester in silence. Nick's behavior, both before and during the tragedy, may have been shaped by these undercurrents. Understanding him requires peeling back layers of expectation, privilege, and personal psychology, all while remaining aware of the human complexity that no single narrative can fully capture. Yet despite all this analysis, there remain gaps. How did the events of that day unfold? What triggered the act of violence? Was it sudden, impulsive, premeditated? And crucially, how did Nick process the aftermath, the shock, and the reality of what he had done? These are questions that investigators, psychologists, and eventually the court will attempt to answer. But for the public, piecing together Nick's life, habits, and personality offers a critical context for the viral courtroom moment that everyone is talking about. Nick Reiner, then, is not just a suspect in a high-profile murder case. He is a son, a brother, a man shaped by a family's expectations, a private life of isolation, and the privileges and pressures of Hollywood culture. His story, leading up to December 14th, is a tapestry of human complexity, personal struggle, and the contradictions of life lived in the shadow of fame. Every detail, every observation, every anecdote brings us closer to understanding not only what happened, but why the world is now captivated by a moment of silence in a Los Angeles courtroom. What do you do when the people you trust most, the ones who shaped your life, become the victims of unimaginable violence? To understand the gravity of this tragedy, we must step back and examine the lives of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner. Not just as public figures, but as parents, spouses, and individuals whose personal and professional worlds were abruptly shattered. Rob Reiner is a name synonymous with Hollywood. A director, producer, and actor whose films have left an indelible mark on American culture. His work has entertained millions and inspired countless creators. When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men, The Princess Bride. These films are more than entertainment. They are cultural touchstones. Yet beyond the accolades and awards lies a man who also navigated the complexities of family life. Rob's public persona was charismatic, warm, and confident. But fame, as is often the case, masks the private realities that define daily existence. Michelle Singer Reiner, though less known to the general public, carved out a respected career in photography. Her work captured moments of beauty and truth, often through the lens of human emotion. Friends describe her as deeply empathetic, insightful, and fiercely committed to her craft. In the Reiner household, Michelle balanced the demands of her career with the responsibilities of raising a family, creating a home filled with love, creativity, and intellectual engagement. Together, Rob and Michelle cultivated a life that many would envy: success, cultural influence, and a seemingly harmonious family. Their Brentwood estate was not merely a home, but a symbol of accomplishment and taste. Light poured through expansive windows, art adorned the walls, and spaces were carefully curated for comfort and beauty. Yet, as with many families, the surface gloss of perfection can conceal turbulence underneath. The day of December 14th began like any other, or so it seemed. In a house that had witnessed decades of life, laughter, and creation, Rob and Michelle went about their routines. Friends and neighbors described the morning as calm, quiet, typical of a family preparing for the day. There were no apparent signs of conflict or distress. But in a matter of hours, their lives would end violently, and the narrative of their family would be forever altered. The medical examiner's report later revealed the devastating truth. Both Rob and Michelle had died from multiple sharp force injuries. The official classification of homicide confirmed the intentional and violent nature of their deaths. Yet these clinical terms can never convey the emotional weight. The shock, fear, and finality experienced in the final moments of life. For a family, a household, and a community, the loss was seismic. The dynamics between the Reiners and their son, Nick, now come under scrutiny. Understanding the parents is not complete without considering their relationships with him. Rob and Michelle, like many parents, had high expectations for their children. They had provided every opportunity, access to elite education, cultural exposure, and personal mentorship. But parenting in the shadow of fame brings unique challenges. Children navigate pressures and expectations that may be invisible to outsiders. Did Nick feel the weight of these expectations? Were there tensions beneath the surface that the public could not see? These are questions that will shape the understanding of the tragedy. Friends describe the Reiners as loving, generous, and deeply connected to their family. Rob, in particular, was known for his mentorship not only in Hollywood but within his own home. He had a reputation for balancing professional intensity with a warmth that drew people in. Michelle, meanwhile, infused the home with creativity, emotional depth, and an attention to detail that made the estate more than just a residence. It was a sanctuary. Yet, even the most attentive parents cannot always see the internal struggles of their children, and sometimes the most tragic events occur in the quiet spaces between observation and understanding. Neighbors recalled the quiet sophistication of the Reiner estate, noting that it was a place of both activity and retreat. The couple hosted gatherings, engaged with friends and colleagues, yet also maintained privacy, respecting the boundaries of family life. On the day of their deaths, these elements of normalcy were abruptly shattered. What had been ordinary, a Sunday morning, a routine check-in by their daughter Romy, turned into a confrontation with mortality that no one could have predicted. Public reaction to their deaths was swift and intense. The loss of Rob Reiner, a beloved figure in film, sparked tributes, condolences, and collective mourning. Michelle's death, equally tragic, prompted reflections on her artistic contributions and the void left in her personal and professional circles. Yet, even as the public grieved, the narrative of the family tragedy was intertwined with questions, suspicions, and the viral moment of Nick's courtroom silence. How could the son of such celebrated individuals commit such an act? What had gone unnoticed in the lives of this seemingly perfect family? The dichotomy between public image and private reality is stark. Rob and Michelle represented success, stability, and creativity. Yet their deaths expose a hidden layer of vulnerability, a family structure susceptible to internal fractures, pressures, and ultimately, violence. It is a reminder that appearances, no matter how meticulously curated, cannot shield against the unpredictability of human behavior. And as investigators examined the scene, pieced together evidence, and spoke to those who knew the family intimately, a complex portrait began to emerge. Rob and Michelle were more than their accomplishments. They were parents, mentors, and human beings with strengths, weaknesses, and relationships that could not be neatly categorized. Their lives and deaths force us to confront difficult questions about family, expectations, and the unseen dynamics that can lead to tragedy. But there were details that no one could yet grasp, subtleties in the interactions, history, and environment that hinted at tensions and motives hidden beneath the surface. The full story of Rob and Michelle, their relationship with their son, and the events leading up to December 14th would continue to unravel in ways no one anticipated. What really happened on December 14th? To understand the tragedy of the Reiner family, we must reconstruct that day minute by minute, hour by hour, because the details matter. The sequence of events paints a chilling picture, revealing how quickly life can shift from normalcy to horror, and why every second counts in understanding this crime. The day began like many others in the Brentwood estate. The sun rose over Los Angeles, spilling light through the expansive windows of the Reiner home. Rob and Michelle, in their 70s, followed their usual morning routines. Perhaps they enjoyed coffee together, discussed plans for the day, or simply basked in the quiet of their luxurious surroundings. Outside, the neighborhood was calm, with neighbors going about weekend errands, unaware that tragedy was looming just a few streets away. Meanwhile, Nick Reiner, 32, resided in the guest house on the property. From the outside, he appeared to live a quiet, unobtrusive life, separate yet close enough to interact with his parents. This proximity, however, now raises countless questions. What was happening in the hours leading up to the attack? Investigators would later seek to trace every movement, every interaction, and every choice, attempting to understand the psychological and logistical path that led to murder. Around mid-morning, a critical moment occurred. The first signs of disruption in the household. Whether it was an argument, an unnoticed tension, or a confrontation that escalated, the details remain murky. Investigators would later rely on forensic evidence, interviews, and electronic records to reconstruct the timeline. What is clear is that the violence was committed in a manner indicating both intent and familiarity. The forensic team documented multiple sharp force injuries inflicted on both Rob and Michelle. The placement and severity of the wounds suggested a personal connection, a knowledge of the victim's routines, and a willingness to engage in extreme violence. Romy, the Reiner's daughter, plays a pivotal role in the timeline. Concerned by unanswered calls or unusual silence, she arrived at the estate to check on her parents. It was she who first discovered the bodies, a moment that would haunt her and become a focal point for media coverage. Her arrival triggered a chain of events. The emergency call to 911, the immediate dispatch of law enforcement, and the mobilization of crime scene investigators. The 911 call, recorded and transcribed, captures a sense of urgency, disbelief, and shock. Romy's voice trembles as she describes the scene, emphasizing the severity and the immediate need for assistance. Officers arrived within minutes, securing the property, ensuring no further harm could occur, and beginning the painstaking process of collecting evidence. Crime scene photographers meticulously documented every detail: the positioning of the bodies, the distribution of blood, the state of the rooms, and any objects that might hold fingerprints or other forensic clues. Simultaneously, investigators focused on the guest house, aware that the son living there was now a critical person of interest. Questions abounded. Where was Nick during the murders? What was his state of mind? Were there any electronic records, such as phone calls, messages, or security camera footage, that could provide insight into the sequence of events? This part of the timeline is crucial because it connects motive, opportunity, and action in a way that will later become central to legal proceedings. By the afternoon, the investigation intensified. Law enforcement began assembling a comprehensive understanding of what had transpired. Interviews with neighbors, family friends, and staff provided contextual details, observations about movement around the property, any unusual behavior, or changes in routine that might explain or hint at the events of that morning. These interviews, combined with physical evidence, allowed investigators to build a preliminary timeline that could withstand scrutiny in both media and court. The evening marked a turning point: Nick Reiner's arrest. He was taken into custody, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and the use of a dangerous weapon. This action closed one chapter of the timeline, but opened another entirely: the legal and psychological chapter that would unfold in public view. Law enforcement, careful not to release premature statements, confirmed the arrests and charges while emphasizing that the investigation was ongoing. The world, however, had already begun reacting. Headlines spread rapidly, with phrases like "Hollywood tragedy" and "son accused of killing parents" dominating media cycles. Throughout this timeline, the contrast between the quiet, orderly life of the Reiners and the violent intrusion into that life is stark. The morning began like any other Sunday, with routines, conversations, and domestic tranquility. Hours later, it ended with murder, arrest, and global attention. The timeline underscores how quickly events can spiral, how fragile life can be, and how hidden tensions, motives, or psychological struggles can erupt with devastating consequences. Every second in this timeline carries weight. Investigators would later examine forensic evidence, electronic records, and personal interactions to pinpoint the exact sequence of actions. How long did the struggle last? Were there attempts to call for help, or was the event over in moments? Did Nick show hesitation, remorse, or any indication of emotional response? These questions are central not only to understanding the crime, but also to interpreting his later viral courtroom behavior. The December 14th timeline also serves another purpose. It lays the foundation for public interpretation. Social media, news outlets, and armchair analysts all rely on these reconstructed moments to form opinions, theories, and speculation. The minute-by-minute account creates a framework in which the viral courtroom moment can be analyzed. When Nick asks for a moment in court and then says nothing, the world is not just reacting to a single point in time. It is processing a day's worth of context, emotion, and action that culminated in this silent, yet profoundly expressive moment. And yet, despite the painstaking reconstruction, gaps remain. Certain details are still unknown, left to be filled in by continued investigation and eventual trial proceedings. These gaps fuel speculation, the why behind the murders, the psychological state of the perpetrator, and the hidden dynamics of a family that outwardly seemed close and loving. Each unanswered question adds tension, inviting the audience to consider their own interpretations, theories, and judgments. The timeline of December 14th is more than a sequence of events. It is a lens through which we begin to understand motive, opportunity, and the psychological interplay of the Reiner family. It is the moment when ordinary life became extraordinary in its horror, setting the stage for a viral court appearance, a global audience, and a story that will continue to unfold in shocking ways. When the world hears that a son has been accused of murdering his own parents, shock barely scratches the surface of what follows. On December 14th, after the horrific discovery at the Brentwood estate, Nick Reiner was arrested. The arrest itself was swift, executed with precision by Los Angeles law enforcement. But it is what came next, the initial court appearance, that captured the world's attention and would become a viral moment defining public perception. The arrest took place later that evening. Police confirmed that Nick was taken into custody on 2 counts of first-degree murder and the use of a dangerous weapon. Though details of the arrest procedure remain mostly confidential, public reports suggest it was carried out without incident. There was no struggle, no public display of emotion. Nick was cooperative but visibly tense, aware of the gravity of the situation and the irreversible consequences now facing him. The news of the arrest spread almost immediately. Headlines dominated every major news outlet. Son arrested in Hollywood couple's murder and Brentwood tragedy. Nick Reiner in custody. Social media erupted, with millions of users sharing updates, speculating on motive, and reacting to the inconceivable nature of the event. The story had all the elements of a modern true crime spectacle: a famous family, a shocking act of violence, and a court appearance that would soon become a focal point for public scrutiny. The court appearance itself was a study in tension. Nick entered the courtroom dressed in standard attire for an accused, maintaining a neutral expression as cameras and observers captured every detail. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft murmur of legal staff and the occasional shuffle of papers. All eyes were on him, and in that silence, a narrative began to form, not through words, but through posture, gaze, and the subtle signals of human behavior. At one point during the proceeding, Nick requested a moment. A pause, brief and deliberate. It was a moment that might have been mundane in any other context, a pause for preparation or composure. But in this courtroom, under the weight of accusation, cameras, and the expectations of a watching world, it became monumental. He asked for a moment, and then he said nothing. The silence that followed was profound, charged with emotion, and immediately seized upon by everyone present. Observers struggled to interpret it. Was it shock? Regret? Strategy? Some analysts suggested that silence can be a powerful communicative tool, conveying awareness, remorse, or even defiance without uttering a word. Psychologists and courtroom experts began weighing in, dissecting the viral clip frame by frame. Every blink, every shift of posture, every hesitation became a potential clue. What might have seemed insignificant in any other moment now carried enormous weight, and the world reacted in real time. The courtroom moment was only the beginning of a media frenzy. News outlets replayed the clip repeatedly, dissecting Nick's demeanor, speculating on his emotional state, and questioning what his silence meant. Social media exploded with commentary. Threads, memes, and heated debates flooded platforms, each interpretation more speculative than the last. The video went viral within hours, cementing Nick's image in the public consciousness not just as an accused murderer, but as a figure defined by a single, haunting moment of quiet. Meanwhile, within the legal proceedings, the stakes were clear. First-degree murder charges carry the possibility of life imprisonment or even more severe consequences. The use of a dangerous weapon, specifically a knife, adds layers of legal and emotional gravity. Every action, word, or gesture by Nick in that courtroom could influence perception, legal strategy, and the trajectory of his case. Observers, from legal analysts to the general public, understood that this moment was both performative and consequential. Beyond the legal and media dimensions, the emotional weight in the courtroom was palpable. Family members, friends, and supporters of the victims sat in stunned silence. The community, still reeling from the shock of the murders, watched as the first public interaction of the accused unfolded. The tension was almost cinematic, a blend of tragedy, suspense, and human complexity that few could turn away from. For investigators, the initial court appearance also served as an important observational opportunity. Behavior, reactions, and composure can offer insights into guilt, remorse, or psychological state. Nick's request for a moment and subsequent silence became part of a larger profile, contributing to a growing understanding of his personality, emotional regulation, and response to extreme stress. Every micro-expression, every pause, and every glance was analyzed, not only by legal experts but by psychologists, criminologists, and eventually, the public. The viral nature of the moment also highlighted the intersection of crime, media, and culture. In a digital age, a single clip can define public perception before the legal process has unfolded. Nick's silence became a symbol, interpreted in countless ways, often without full context, yet universally compelling. It transformed a routine legal proceeding into a global spectacle, raising questions about human behavior, media ethics, and the public's fascination with tragedy. And yet, as public attention fixated on this silent moment, the deeper layers of the case remained obscured. What were the specific circumstances leading to the murders? What internal dynamics, personal struggles, or environmental factors contributed to the events of December 14th? How would the investigation proceed in the coming days and weeks? These questions loomed large, ensuring that the story was far from over. Nick Reiner's arrest and initial court appearance were more than procedural steps. They were a window into a human drama of unprecedented scale. The viral moment, his silence, and the courtroom tension captured the world's attention, setting the stage for an intricate narrative of motive, psychology, and family tragedy. Every detail mattered, every gesture was analyzed, and every silence spoke volumes. What does a medical examiner's report really tell us? On the surface, it is clinical, detached, precise. Multiple sharp force injuries, homicide, date of death, December 14th. These are the terms that were officially released in the case of Rob and Michelle Reiner. But behind these clinical words lies a story of violence, timing, and human fragility that no headline can fully capture. Understanding the report is essential because it not only confirms the brutality of the act, but also provides insights into how and why it occurred. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office documented the findings meticulously. Multiple sharp force injuries were identified on both victims, indicating repeated stabbing motions rather than a single impulsive act. The nature of these injuries suggests intent, familiarity, and perhaps even emotion driving the perpetrator. Sharp force injuries are particularly revealing because they can indicate the angle, strength, and sometimes even the psychological state of the attacker. Each wound is a data point, a clue about proximity, timing, and the sequence of events. For Rob Reiner, the injuries were concentrated in areas consistent with defensive reactions, suggesting he attempted to protect himself. For Michelle, the pattern of injuries indicated that she may have been caught off guard or had less opportunity to defend herself. Together, these observations paint a harrowing picture, a confrontation that escalated quickly, leaving both victims unable to escape the attack. The precision and repetition of the stabbings point to an act that was personal, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Beyond the physical injuries, the report also emphasizes the manner of death, homicide. This classification is critical because it establishes the legal framework for the investigation and prosecution. Homicide, by definition, involves the intentional taking of life by another person. It distinguishes the case from accidental death, natural causes, or self-inflicted harm, leaving little ambiguity about the nature of the crime. This legal categorization sets the stage for the charges against Nick Reiner and frames public perception of the severity of the act. The timing of the deaths, confirmed as December 14th, eliminates much of the earlier speculation. Media outlets and social platforms were rife with conflicting reports in the immediate aftermath of the discovery. Some suggested the deaths could have occurred earlier or later. The official medical report provides clarity, anchoring the timeline of the tragedy. Combined with the sequence of discovery by Romy, the arrest of Nick, and the subsequent courtroom appearance, this date becomes the fulcrum upon which the entire story pivots. The medical examiner's report also includes critical forensic details that are less widely reported but no less important. Blood spatter analysis, depth of wounds, and the distribution of injuries all contribute to reconstructing the events in the house. Investigators use this information to determine not just how the murders were committed, but potentially the sequence, timing, and even the psychological state of the perpetrator during the act. Forensic experts can analyze the angle of each wound, the force applied, and the trajectory to understand the dynamics of the attack. This kind of analysis is painstaking, technical, and crucial to building an accurate narrative. But even as the medical report clarifies many questions, it also introduces new mysteries. Why did the confrontation occur in the manner it did? Were there pre-existing tensions or triggers that escalated to lethal violence? Could anything have prevented the tragedy, or was it the culmination of forces invisible to everyone outside the house? These questions linger, haunting both investigators and the public. In addition, the report indirectly informs the understanding of Nick Reiner's behavior in court. Knowing the brutality of the murders, the number and severity of the injuries, and the deliberate nature of the act provides context for the viral moment when he asked for a pause and then remained silent. Observers who watched him might now reconsider what that silence represented. Shock, remorse, calculation, or a complex mixture of all three. The medical facts lend weight to the psychological and emotional interpretation of the courtroom footage. Experts in forensic pathology often emphasize that every detail in the medical report can influence legal strategy. Prosecutors can use the specifics of the injuries to argue intent and premeditation. Defense attorneys may attempt to interpret the same evidence to suggest impulsivity, emotional disturbance, or diminished capacity. Every nuance matters, from the location of the wounds to the timing of death, and all contribute to the larger narrative that will unfold in court. Finally, the medical examiner's report serves a broader social function. It transforms speculation into verified fact, grounding public discussion in reality. While media headlines and social media commentary swirl with rumor and conjecture, the report stands as an authoritative voice, a touchstone for truth in a story filled with shock, emotion, and viral moments. Yet, even as it provides clarity, it deepens the emotional resonance of the tragedy, reminding the world that Rob and Michelle Reiner were real people, victims of an act that is as incomprehensible as it is devastating. The clinical language, multiple sharp force injuries, homicide, cannot capture the human cost, the finality of lives ended too soon, or the ripple effects on family, friends, and community. But it sets the stage for everything that comes next. The investigation, the courtroom drama, the viral moment that would define public perception, and the ongoing attempt to make sense of a tragedy that seems almost unimaginable. To understand what happened on December 14th, you have to step inside the guest house where Nick Reiner lived. It was more than just a place to sleep. It was a reflection of his personality, a private world adjacent to the family home, and now a crucial piece of the investigation. Every object, every detail, every nuance inside the guest house could provide insight into the mind of the man accused of murdering his parents. The guest house itself was a modern, stylish structure, smaller than the main estate but outfitted with all the comforts expected of a high-profile Hollywood property. Large windows allowed sunlight to flood the space during the day, and the interiors were tastefully furnished, reflecting Nick's personal style. Minimalistic, practical, with a few carefully chosen decorative elements. To an outsider, it was serene, almost unremarkable, but to investigators, every corner, every surface was potential evidence. Neighbors recall that Nick kept largely to himself. He rarely entertained visitors, and when he did, it was in controlled, quiet circumstances. His life seemed contained within the walls of the guest house, a microcosm separate from the main estate, where his parents lived. This separation, while subtle, speaks volumes about family dynamics. On the one hand, it allowed independence. On the other, it may have created isolation, emotional or social, that contributed to escalating tensions leading up to the tragedy. Law enforcement examined the guest house thoroughly. Investigators were particularly interested in digital evidence. Computers, phones, security systems, and other devices that could establish movements, communications, or potential premeditation. These devices became a window into Nick's life, revealing patterns, interactions, and perhaps conflicts that had gone unnoticed until that day. Digital footprints, after all, often tell stories that the human eye cannot. Messages sent, searches made, and behavior logged over time can all provide insight into motive, state of mind, and emotional trajectory. Physical evidence within the guest house was also critical. Objects that might seem mundane, furniture placement, household items, or signs of disorder, were examined for context. Investigators considered questions such as, were there signs of agitation? Did he leave in a hurry? Was anything missing or out of place that could suggest premeditation or planning? Every observation added to a larger understanding of how the morning unfolded, how he may have moved between the guest house and the main estate, and what role his environment played in the tragedy. Psychologically, the guest house may have been a double-edged sword. It offered privacy and a degree of separation from family pressures, yet it also may have fostered a sense of isolation. Behavioral experts often note that physical separation within families can intensify emotional distance, exacerbate unresolved conflicts, or allow simmering resentment to fester unnoticed. Nick's choice, or the family's decision, to have him live in a guest house rather than the main house created both physical and symbolic separation, which could be significant in understanding the dynamics that led to December 14th. Friends and acquaintances of Nick paint a complex picture of the man behind the guest house walls. Some described him as thoughtful, intelligent, and self-contained. Others noticed periods of withdrawal, unusual irritability, or obsession with private projects. These behavioral patterns, when considered alongside the physical environment, suggest a personality that was inward-facing, possibly introverted, and potentially under stress. Understanding this context is key to interpreting the later viral courtroom moment, the pause, the silence, the weight of the accusations he now faced. The guest house also played a role in logistics and opportunity. Its proximity to the main estate meant that Nick was never far from his parents, literally steps away. Yet the separate structure could also provide a vantage point, a space to prepare, observe, or retreat. Investigators would later consider how this physical layout might have influenced the timeline, movement, and decisions on December 14th. Every doorway, hallway, and window became a point of interest, a potential clue to the sequence of events that unfolded that day. Even mundane objects could carry significance. Security cameras, door locks, personal items, and household electronics were all examined. Investigators searched for anything that could reveal communication between Nick and his parents, signs of confrontation, or premeditation. The guest house, in this way, was both a private sanctuary and a piece of evidence, a controlled environment that now offered insight into the mind of the accused. But beyond the forensic and logistical aspects, the guest house symbolizes something deeper, the life Nick led in the shadows of his parents' success. It was a space of independence, yes, but also of emotional and social isolation. It represents a microcosm of a life lived in proximity to family, yet emotionally distant, physically near, yet psychologically removed. And in the context of December 14th, that separation may have been more significant than anyone realized at the time. In every high-profile crime, the investigation is where the story begins to take shape. For the Reiner case, law enforcement had a rare combination of clarity and complexity. The crime scene was contained within a private estate. The suspect lived on the property, and forensic evidence could be meticulously documented. Yet the case was also complicated by the human elements, family dynamics, celebrity status, and public scrutiny that added layers of pressure and expectation to every decision made by investigators. From the moment officers arrived at the Brentwood estate, the focus was on preserving the scene. Crime scene investigators cordoned off the main house and guest house, taking care to avoid contamination. Every surface, every object, and every drop of blood was documented. Photographs, 3D scans, and sketches captured the positions of the victims, the surrounding environment, and the potential pathways of movement throughout the home. The level of detail was exhaustive. In cases involving homicide within a family home, investigators leave nothing to chance. One of the most critical pieces of the investigation was the forensic examination of the sharp force injuries. Analysts studied wound patterns, angles, depth, and force to reconstruct the sequence of attacks. This data not only confirmed the cause and manner of death, but also provided insight into the possible psychology of the attacker. Each wound was a clue. Some suggested defensive reactions, others indicated deliberate targeting. Investigators pieced together these elements to determine how the confrontation unfolded step by step. In addition to the physical evidence, digital footprints became a central focus. Nick Reiner's devices, phones, laptops, and other electronics were seized and analyzed. Investigators looked for messages, searches, or communications that might provide insight into motive, planning, or intent. Every email, every social media interaction, and even metadata from apps was scrutinized. In modern investigations, digital evidence can be as telling as physical evidence, revealing patterns, timelines, and sometimes the emotional state of the suspect. Security footage from the estate was another pivotal element. Cameras positioned around the property, including the guest house and main house, captured movements throughout the morning. While the footage may not have shown the murders directly, it provided context. When individuals entered or left rooms, any unusual activity, and potential interactions between Nick and his parents. In high-profile cases, such visual records are critical in corroborating witness statements and reconstructing the events leading up to a crime. Investigators also interviewed neighbors, staff, and friends to understand the social and behavioral context of the family. Were there signs of tension between Nick and his parents? Had anyone noticed unusual behavior in the days leading up to the murders? These interviews provided qualitative data that complemented the physical and digital evidence. Patterns emerged, periods of withdrawal, moments of irritation, and subtle signals of conflict that, in hindsight, might have hinted at the underlying dynamics within the Reiner household. Forensic analysis extended beyond wounds and digital footprints. Blood spatter patterns were studied to determine positions and movements during the attack. Fingerprints and DNA evidence were meticulously cataloged. Items within the home were examined for signs of struggle or intentional placement. Every piece of evidence contributed to constructing a timeline, understanding the sequence of events, and determining potential motives. Public scrutiny added another layer of complexity. News outlets and social media users were intensely focused on every detail of the investigation. Rumors and speculations circulated widely, forcing law enforcement and prosecutors to manage both factual reporting and the narrative that shaped public perception. Investigators had to operate in a highly visible arena, balancing the need for methodical evidence collection with the pressures of constant media attention. By combining physical evidence, digital data, eyewitness accounts, and forensic analysis, investigators began to form a coherent picture. The convergence of these elements suggested a sequence in which opportunity, proximity, and emotional tension intersected tragically. The evidence increasingly pointed toward Nick Reiner as the primary suspect, providing both the factual foundation for charges and context for understanding his viral courtroom moment. Yet even with this extensive body of evidence, questions remained. Investigators could outline the what, when, and where of the murders, but the why was more elusive. What triggered the violence? How did family dynamics, personal struggles, and psychological factors converge to produce an outcome that no one anticipated? These mysteries ensured that public fascination would remain high, as viewers and readers sought to understand the human forces behind the crime. The investigation also set the stage for the legal drama to come. Every detail collected by law enforcement would feed into pretrial motions, discovery, and eventual courtroom proceedings. Forensic evidence, digital records, and witness testimony would be scrutinized, challenged, and interpreted in ways that could determine the outcome of the case. Understanding the scope and depth of the investigation is therefore essential. not only for appreciating the complexity of the case, but also for contextualizing the viral moment when Nick Reiner asked for a pause in court and said nothing. The investigation, meticulous and exhaustive, provides the backbone of the story. It bridges the gap between the crime itself and the courtroom drama that captivates the public. Every minute of analysis, every piece of evidence, and every